everyone, Charles Moscowitz here. And my guest emanating from the United Kingdom is Lord Christopher Monckton, the Viscount of Brenchley. And he's a peer of the House of Lords. He's a British politician, columnist, journalist, author, activist. Lord Monckton, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Well, Charles, it's a pleasure to be with you. I don't actually have a seat in the House of Lords because they took that right away from my father, rather unconstitutionally, along with most peers, in 1999, a socialist government, of course. It never found anything to replace us with. So I have the title, but no longer the power.
Well, let me just talk a little about that. What presently constitutes then the upper chambers of the British Parliament? What is the House of Lords?
I think the best description was a former leader of the Labour Party called Michael Foot, who describes it, I think very justly, as a parking lot for old vehicles that have had their day. They're placemen from the political parties mostly. They are a pretty undistinguished and inarticulate bunch. And it's probably fair to say that the likes of me who don't have seats in the House of Lords, on the whole, have louder and more penetrating voices on the international stage than most of those who do sit there.
And you come from, I'd like to ask this, and I think that a lot of my American viewers would be curious about your heredity, your background. I mean, do you go back to William the Conqueror?
We go back pretty much that far. Yes, the furthest back we can go for certain is 1296, because the College of Arms, which kept the records of the noble families of the time, did what's called a visitation of Yorkshire, where my family comes from, and in around Malton on the East Riding, that's where we used to be. And they recorded us as already being in existence there, already having a coat of arms. But when we got in touch with them recently and said, OK, find out when you originally granted us our coat of arms, they had lost the records. But our arms are quartered with those of St. Quintin, which was a Norman family that came over with the conquest. So at some stage, and possibly as soon as immediately after the conquest, we captured the heart of a St. Quintin and therefore became part of the sort of Norman-British mélange that happened after the conquest. So I think it's probably fair to say that we went back to the conquest, but we can only prove that we can go back to 1296. And I was having this out with another peer the other day who has an enormous country pile up in Lancashire. And he was saying, of course, you know, we've been continuously in this house since the 11th century. Wow. And I said, oh, that's really impossibly nouveau. And he looked a bit shocked. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, on my mother's side, my mother's family have been in the same house since the 9th century.
Oh, my. So then that was around the time of William. It was actually before William the Conqueror.
That's well before William the Conqueror.
It was during the time of the Saxons and Alfred the Great.
Making ourselves blue and making mud pies and making ourselves to the Scots. Yes, that's right.
Fantastic. And do you live in a house that is similar to that which we see on Downton Abbey?
I used to. We bought one in Scotland some years ago, and we had 5 years there while we did it up. I then fell very sick, so we decided we would sell it and move somewhere easier. And so we now live in what is really not much more than a cottage with a fine thatched roof, roses round the door, duck pond in front. And very comfortable and a lot easier to run, because when you get old and crotchety and not very well, which is where I am now, it tends to be better not to try to manage a large establishment.
Now, you've been active in British politics. You were in the UKIP movement, which led to the Brexit, which has been a successful move finally under Boris Johnson. Are you possibly in line to become a prime minister?
I think it's highly unlikely that the carpet of destiny will be dusted off and unrolled in front of my feet. I think the reason is that those of us who supported Margaret Thatcher have been marginalized in the Conservative Party ever since. I think under Boris Johnson that may begin to change, but it certainly hasn't changed yet. People like John Redwood and Peter Lilly, who actually know how to run things, but they had the fatal defect that they were Thatcherites, have excluded from the councils of government. They're in the House, but that nobody pays any attention to them because they are tainted with having been Thatcherites. So far has the Conservative Party moved to the left, and even Boris Johnson, though he finally realised that if he wanted the backing of the Conservative Party in the country, which he needed in order to become Prime Minister, he realised he had to pretend that he was in favour of Brexit, which he hadn't been in favour of until that time, but he realised it was a good political move. He calls himself a one-nation Tory, which was a phrase originally invented by Rab Butler, who would have become Prime Minister when Macmillan became Prime Minister, except that Rab was on the left and Macmillan was closer to the centre-right of the party, which is where the real heart of the party is. So the Thatcherites, like me, have been excluded from getting anywhere near the levers of power, really ever since John Major, who absolutely hated what he called the poisonous cloud of ideologues surrounding the Prime Minister. And so he excluded all of us. And that is to a large extent still the case. But of course, the success that we have recently had in forcing this lumpen, unwilling establishment to set us free from the cloying communistic European tyranny by Clark has been an occasion for the most enormous degree of schadenfreude. We've been cackling and chuckling to ourselves ever since it happened.
And yet Boris Johnson won a substantial mandate under the guise of Brexit and sticking with the deadline. And from an outsider perspective, it looks to me like he was able to do it.
He has substantially done it. What he did was to repackage Theresa May's lamentable instrument of capitulation and call it his own. So we have still very largely capitulated to the tyranny by Clark, and we will still, to a much larger extent than I would wish, be governed directly by it, even though in future we will have no say in how it operates. But at least we will, nominally at any rate, be free of it. And that does give us the chance over time, as our relationship with it develops, to break ourselves ever freer from it and once again trade freely with the rest of the world. And I think it's in free trade that the greatest advantage of leaving the tyranny by Clark is going to show through. And they are terrified that we will start doing away with particularly the environmental and other useless trammeling regulations that tie down British business and make it more expensive. And that if we go back to a lighter regulation, effective but light, compared with the EU, everybody around the world will want to do business with Britain rather than Europe. And the main purpose of the European stance in the negotiations is to make sure that we have to continue suffering, in particular the environmental regulations, which unfortunately the likes of Boris Johnson, who is marrying a fanatic from the terrorist group Extinction Rebellion, he has therefore bought into all this climate change drivel. And so he is going to mesh us into this European system of totally unnecessary regulation of non-existent global warming, so that we won't get anything like the full advantage from breaking free from Europe that I would have liked to see.
And yet the people of Britain have spoken in a very clear voice, and I think that their objection to the Brexit, to the union, was quite real and quite palpable. I mean, you have these unelected, appointed bureaucrats in Brussels making rules and regulations and laws and decrees that affect the personal life of every Briton, whether it be the education of their children, the environment, as you point out, welfare, healthcare, so many other areas. And that I think the British people suddenly were waking up and realizing that they had lost their democratic rights, their rights to representative government.
We had lost our democracy. We had lost our right to govern ourselves through the ballot box. It didn't matter who we elected. The commissars, that's the group of 20 or 30 unelected appointees who, just like the Politburo of the Soviet Union, on which the EU's constitution is very closely modelled. They had the and exercised several thousand times a month the right to issue what are called commission regulations. Now, these are effectively ukases, decrees, edicts, ordinances of the dictatorial power, and they have the immediate force of supreme law throughout the European Union from the moment of their promulgation, and no parliament, whether the elected Duma of Europe or the proper elected parliaments of the individual member states, has any right to question any of these commission regulations whatsoever. And this is not at all widely known, that the vast majority of European so-called legislation is edicts handed down by the Politburo or the commissars or the
Exactly. No, couldn't have put it better. It's completely undemocratic. It's a trend that the Brexit movement has tried to buck, as well as has the movement that elected Donald Trump president of the United States. And I think the Yellow Jackets in Paris and the Hong Kong rebels and movements around the world are trying to reassert the importance of sovereignty, of national sovereignty,
well,
and why that is a progressive idea.
Hong Kong was a great tragedy. I tried very hard to persuade Sir Geoffrey Howe, when he was Foreign Secretary, that he should make sure that Hong Kong was able to start electing a representative council. They had a legislative council, but it didn't really have any real powers. I wanted them to give it real powers and elect it, so that by the time the Chinese takeaway came along on the 1st of July 1999, the Hong Kong people would be so used to democracy and would have a democratic system already in place that the Chinese would find it very difficult to dismantle it. And I had managed to persuade the governor of Hong Kong that he should do this, but the Foreign Office, which were completely in the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party, were absolutely against it. I remember having a long talk with the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee at the time, who was an old China hand, that terrible phrase for people who've gone naked. And
those are people who went pro-communist.
Not as people who loved the Chinese people, but who were up the duff, if I may put it bluntly, of the Chinese Communist Party, which is quite another thing. And so the Foreign Office would not countenance any degree of democracy for Hong Kong before we left. Had we done that, I think the Hong Kong democracy movement would have been in a much stronger position now to assert its case over against the Chinese Communist Party, which rules it with an increasingly iron grip and increasingly in defiance of the terms of the agreement by which there was supposed to be two separate systems of government over Hong Kong for the next 50 years. But the Chinese communists have realized that if they go on doing that, the Hong Kong people will eventually want to break free. They would rather, frankly, be governed by us with the very light touch that was the characteristic of the British Empire, than they would by the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-busybodying, cruel, vicious Chinese communist tyranny, which has launched the coronavirus onto the world.
All right, I want to get into that, but just also you make reference to the China hands. They're the same people in the United States that sold China out to the Mao Zedong in the late 1940s, and that's a very interesting story of how that happened. Before we go to the virus, I just want to bring up one other issue, and that is that I'm following the case of Tommy Robinson. Now, Tommy Robinson is someone living in Luton, which is a community north of London that has a very high concentration of Pakistani immigrants. All he did was expose this phenomena of these rape gangs, these gangs that were grooming and raping young English girls, basically, and that these cases were being brought up in various jurisdictions throughout England, and they were being swept under the rug by the judges and the magistrates for years, and that these rape gangs were allowed to proliferate throughout the country. They, for all I know, they still are doing it. And that to any discussion or any criticism, I guess in Britain, it's actually illegal to even discuss an ongoing legal case, which is not, this country isn't that bad, but
no, it's not quite that. Let me give you a bit of background. He was neither the first nor the only person to come across this problem of the rape gangs. But he tried to politicize it in a way which, in fact, has made it much harder for us to deal with the problem. His difficulty was that he decided that he ought to have the right to report details of cases in the magistrate's court when the restrictions on reporting those cases had not been lifted. Now, whether or not one thinks that cases in the courts should have such restrictions on them, a Labour government back in the early 1970s, if I remember rightly, introduced these restrictions so as to protect those who were in fact innocent but could have their reputations trashed if in the magistrate's court their case came up, all the gory details were broadcast, then it was found at trial later on that they were not guilty. By that stage, they'd lost their reputation. So that was the thinking behind the Labour Party's action. I myself, as a journalist by origin, still don't like that legislation, but it is the law. That is the reason for it, such as it is. And what Tommy Robinson did was to go into a court to report on a case on which the reporting restrictions had not been lifted after he had been warned that he should not report on it. And then he was called back by the judge and warned again, and again he reported the case. And it was only then that the judge said, well, if you simply will not comply with the law, I'm going to have to cite you in contempt of court, and you're going to have to do a few days in prison to think about it. So that's what actually happened. And he is unfortunately a bit of an embarrassment to those of us who would like to see the problem of political correctness in the police, by which they have become, not really through any fault of their own, terrified of dealing with any case where somebody has a skin that is a little bit darker than white, for fear of being accused of being racists by the extreme left. They tend to overreact in the other direction. And here I do have some sympathy for the police. It's a very difficult position that they find themselves in. It's a very difficult line to tread, with the extreme left using race as a method of division, just as they do in the States with all these grievance studies at the Marxist universities and so forth. Right. And so the police, on the one hand, ought to have been much more active in joining up the dots and stopping these rape gangs from going around and doing their thing. On the other hand, they feared that if they did, every move they took would immediately be pounced upon by the extreme left and described as racist, which it really wasn't. There was a real problem. Tommy Robinson actually came quite late to the table in pointing it out. Somebody else had been much more active for years before that. It does continue to be a real problem, because it's very difficult for the police to know how to handle anything where there is a systemic problem arising in a community other than the white community, because if they go after that systemic problem, they're immediately accused of racism. However false that accusation is, they find it very, very difficult to do their job. So there is a kind of balance to be struck here. These rape gangs were and are an outrage, and they're going to have to be stopped. And I think the only way we can kind of liberate the police so as to stop them is to say that all this endless chatter about racism every time the police try to do their job has got to count as though it were obstruction of the police. If it's carried beyond a certain point of reason, you've got to allow free speech, but there comes a point where it becomes obstruction of the police in the exercise of their duties, and it's got to be stopped. And some of these extreme left-wing groups that exploit issues like this as a way of getting at the police, they have got to be put back in their box. And we may need to change the law a little bit to say that if you unreasonably accuse somebody of racism when they're just trying to do their job, then you can go to prison for that.
Well, I mean, I don't know about prison, but nevertheless, the whole issue of accusations of racism is one of the biggest weapons in the arsenal of the left. Certainly has been in this country, and one of the reasons they despise Donald Trump in this country is that he doesn't pay any attention to that. He doesn't buy it. You know, he challenges it.
Gloriously, triumphantly.
Absolutely. And in that sense, he's standing up for the freedom of all of us when he does that.
The left-wing academics who are endlessly trying to psychoanalyze him and say, well, look at the language he uses. It's the language of an adolescent. Well, yes, it is, because he knows perfectly well not being anything like as stupid as he's made out to be by the Mark stream media. He knows if you speak in plain English, using simple language, you will reach far more people far more effectively than if you talk the pseudo-intellectual gobbledygook that the left-wing media currently favour. And so he's cutting right through the fog of this endless sort of grievance studies chatter you get from the left-wing, the Marxo media. And he is talking straight over their heads and straight to the ordinary people. And that is why I shall be fascinated to see how well he does at the upcoming re-election, because although I think he fumbled a bit during the early stages of the coronavirus outbreak, now he's getting on with it. And Dr. Fauci, who takes very much the cautious line on this, at first said, he found Mr. Trump very difficult. But he said, this was interesting because Margaret Thatcher was the same. If Fauci, whenever he stood his ground and said, look, I'm sorry, Mr. President, but these are the facts, and I beg you to understand, I'm not trying to shoot a political line. These are the facts, and I would like you to act on the basis that you have clearly understood and internalized these facts, then every time Mr. Trump will stand back and accept what he's told, once he is convinced that he is being told the truth. And that willingness to change one's mind in the face of the evidence is very rare in politics, and the left would never admit that he has it any more than they would with Margaret Thatcher. But he has, I can see this in him, exactly the same quality of being willing to listen and to work with the information, the best information he can get, rather than simply being driven by some sort of abstract ideology. She was exactly the same. She had an ideology. She believed in liberty just as he does, just as you and I do. But when it comes, for instance, to locking down the country for a time for the sake of allowing the health services and hospitals not to be completely swamped, not to have complete anarchy as a result, then Mr. Trump, albeit that it went against his instincts just as it goes against mine, said, yes, in this we have to be activists rather than pacifists. We have to stop this happening. And so slowly but surely, the numbers are coming right. If you look at just the raw numbers, it won't look like it for the next few weeks in America or in Britain. There'll continue to be alarming numbers dying, alarming numbers of new cases reported. But the trend in the daily growth of new cases and of new deaths is downward, both in the United States and in most other European countries, very firmly downward now, because people, whether there are lockdowns in place or not, are beginning to learn that they have to be cautious. In Sweden and South Korea, for instance, they have no lockdowns at all, and yet they don't have large numbers of cases. Why? Because the people themselves have locked themselves down without having to be told. If you have a sufficiently mature democracy, people will do that. Sure. And that's what they did in Sweden. There's 60% less travel on public transport in Sweden and in South Korea as there was before. 60% down it is. And of course, it's much more than that now in countries like Britain, which have lockdowns, because we took far too long to act. The day before Trump brought in his lockdown, for instance, the last day of the Cheltenham Festival saw tens of thousands of people standing out, all mingling close to each other long after. It was blindingly obvious to all but the most ideological that that kind of vast assembly was guaranteed to spread this virus at a rate of knots. So now that kind of assembly no longer happens. In Sweden, the government merely had to say, please don't have large gatherings. And as long as you have only small ones, as long as you try to avoid getting too close to people you don't know, then we'll leave it to you. And in a country with a low population density like Sweden, you can do that. But in London, which has 5 times the population density of, say, central Stockholm, we couldn't do that. We actually had to have a lockdown. It won't be there for very long, but it was there just so that we could make sure that the healthcare system wasn't completely overwhelmed, as it was in very grave danger of being. So there again, one sees this attempt on the part of the centre-right parties to strike a sensible balance rather than taking a purely ideological position. And it seems to me that one of the attractions of the centre-right as against the left is the left see everything in ideological and political terms. Centre-right are much more pragmatic and sensible, and willing to be driven by evidence than merely to be driven by some ghastly party line, and usually on the left these days a communist party line.
That's right.
I've been appalled to see how unwilling the Democrats, so-called, in America have been to criticize the Chinese Communist Party for having lied to the effect that there was nothing to worry about in Wuhan, for having lied so that they concealed from the World Health Organization and everybody else that there was a new and fatal infection raging there, for having kept stum while 5 million people from Wuhan were allowed to travel all over the world in the period running up to the Chinese New Year, after the Chinese Communist Party knew perfectly well that that would inevitably spread the infection to the rest of the world. Then the Chinese Communist Party refused to allow a team from its wholly owned subsidiary poodle, the World Death Organization, to go in and look at what was going on. They shut everything down and cleaned everything up before they allowed that team in, only several weeks late. They then denied that the infection could spread from person to person. And when Taiwan found out that it could, because they got cases that clearly had spread from person to person, they reported that to the World Death Organization, which refused to do anything with the information on the ground that Taiwan, at China's insistence, doesn't belong to the World Health Organization. So, and I then saw at the Munich Security Conference, where all the intelligence community gathers once a year, this was held on February the 15th, again, arguably far too late. They shouldn't have held any such conference, but it was. And there was a session at which the Irish communist who heads the emergency response facility at the World Health Organization made a cringing speech saying how wonderful China had been in suppressing this epidemic and working with the WHO, when every word of what he was saying was a lie. And there, sitting directly opposite him, with looking like the cat that got the cream, was no less than the foreign minister, a member of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party, who then made a speech saying how important it was that because only at that time only 1% of cases of this virus were outside China, this showed how China had been responsible in making sure that everybody was alerted in time. And of course, by then it was already clear to the likes of me that all the cases were going to end up outside China because they had kept stum for so long and kept quiet about it. And so then you had the World Death Organization issuing statements that you mustn't have travel bans to and from China, you must allow free trade and free movement in and out of China. There was no need to lock it down. And of course, why were they saying this? Because they were told by the Chinese Communist Party to say it. And who had the Chinese Communist Party backed? Well, the previous head of the World Health Organization was a Chinese communist, backed by the Chinese leadership. The present guy is an Ethiopian communist. He was a supporter, among other things, of a hideous terrorist group called the Tigray Liberation Front, Marxist-backed, Russian and Chinese paid for, not Russian paid for these days. And it was they, the Chinese Communist Party, that backed his nomination and actively campaigned for him. In effect, what they said is, if you don't let him be the one, we won't play. So he was appointed at the behest and instigation of China, this ghastly man, Ghebreyesus. And he has been lying through his teeth from start to finish to please his Chinese paymasters. So already the Henry Jackson Society in this country, John Bolton, former security chief to Donald Trump in the United States, and many other voices are saying that there is going to have to be a crimes against humanity trial at the International Criminal Court, at which China and its conspirators, the leadership of the World Death Organization, nearly all of whom are communists, will be tried together. You have the whole Politburo, all 25 of them, plus all the leadership of the WHO. There are 7,000 people in the WHO. What the heck they're all doing, I don't know, but they were entirely unprepared for this pandemic. And when it came along, they spent months giving precisely the wrong advice and allowing China to lie and not holding China's feet to the fire at any stage, even as late as February the 15th, when everybody knew China had lied. This communist from Ireland was still saying in the security meeting how wonderful China had been and how unhelpful it was. There had been some voice raised at other sessions of this particular security conference, suggesting that perhaps China had not done the right thing. I've never seen such a cringing, lickspittle,
Oh my God.
speech from a senior official. This raises very serious questions about whether we should allow communist or other dictatorial countries to belong to any of these supranational institutions, whether it be the UN, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, because they do not play by the rules. They use these organizations purely to serve their totalitarian ends. And that to the democracies should be a concern, because we are transferring more and more power and wealth to the World Death Organization. For instance, it spent 800 million of the $2 billion it got from member states. And remember, 750 billion per year of that comes from the United States. 750 million comes from their $2 billion budget. They were spending effectively all of the US contribution and a bit more on top, just on first class travel and swank hotels. All their personnel going around the world.
Very corrupt.
They've got to travel, but do they have to do it first class rather than business class? And do they have to stay in 7-star hotels rather than the local pensione? I think not. So there's going to have to be the father and mother of all inquiries into the World Death Organization. Ghebreyesus is going to have to be sacked. Ryan, the Irish communist, is going to have to be sacked. The former deputy to Ghebreyesus, who was demoted recently, who led the team that eventually got into China, he's going to have to be sacked. Because when he was interviewed by a Hong Kong news agency a couple of weeks ago, and he was asked about whether Taiwan was going to be allowed to become a member of the World Health Organization, he refused to answer and eventually hung up the phone. They rang back. He then pretended not to have heard the question. They asked the question again, and he said, let's move along to another question. He wouldn't answer. Then he was asked, had Taiwan done a good job in containing the infection, which it has. It's second only to South Korea in having handled it effectively. And this was the reply from this ghastly little communist, who at least they've now stopped him being Deputy Director General, though he's still got a cushy job at WHO. He said this. He said that every region of China had done a wonderful job in containing the infection. He was including Taiwan as though it were a region of China, because that is the Communist Party line. And that was the line that he, as a communist, was willing to sing. And he's a fellow called Aylward. He is going to have to go. And I think that Aylward and Ryan and Ghebreyesus should be on trial for crimes against humanity with the Politburo, all 25 of them, Xi Jinping, his foreign minister in particular, and all the rest of them, and probably some of the local officials in Hubei province as well. Put them all on trial together because they conspired, and there's no other word that will work. The evidence of their conspiracy is very clear. They conspired to cover this up purely so as to favor the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, and that has resulted in already close to 100,000 deaths worldwide. It's a pretty serious crime against humanity, and they should be held to account for it. But will they? I rather suspect they won't. Partly because our Western democracies are so flabby, and partly because our Western democracies are so heavily in hock financially to Communist China. Because Communist China, through a bogus currency called the renminbi, which it uses for lending to foreign governments so that it doesn't cause inflation in the yuan, which is the internal currency. It's a very clever arrangement. They can effectively print renminbi, thereby acquire a debt obligation by lending this money at no cost to themselves, because it's just invented out of a computer.
That's right, they just print it.
But they get a real obligation for the money to be repaid, and to be repaid not in Mickey Mouse renminbi, but in real money, in real value. And so by this means, this is what's called in the intelligence community debt trap diplomacy. They are taking control over how countries such as the United States and Britain administer themselves and conduct their relations with China. And Margaret Thatcher was given a very good brief on this by the intelligence community at the time when she first became Prime Minister, because I used to work for her. And the first thing she did as a result of that briefing was to order a complete list of all debts that the HM government had accumulated under the previous Communist Labour Party to China, Russia, and other totalitarian countries.
Mm-hmm.
And all debts to all foreign countries were paid back within 6 months of her taking office.
That's incredible.
She said, quite rightly, one cannot be a sovereign nation and defend the interests of one's people internationally with any degree of authority if one owes money to the people one is trying to negotiate with on behalf of our citizens. So she was very straightforward and very clear about that. Now, because Mr. Trump has been, unlike Margaret Thatcher, but very like Ron Reagan, fiscally grossly indisciplined, and it's the one sad side of what he's been doing, he continues, I think, to be heavily in debt to China himself. And therefore, although he has been speaking out a little bit against China, when push comes to shove, he tends to retreat again. And I don't think we're going to see the determined action against China that ought to happen here, because they've got us under our thumb by having lent so much money to us. One of the things I'm going to try to find out here, it's a bit difficult with Parliament shut down, is just how much we have borrowed from China as a government. Because the government is very careful not to tell us these figures, but it is required to tell a member of Parliament if he asks. So I'm going to make sure that the question is put down in the House of Lords about that. They are going to have to answer it, because I'm going to find somebody who is very persistent at asking it. And we'll try and find out just how much in hock to China we are, because that's what China has done. And as it has got more and more of the Western countries under its thumb through this debt trap diplomacy, so its foreign policy and its military stance are becoming increasingly aggressive. I think if I were the government in Taiwan, I would not be sleeping at all easy in my bed at the moment. I think we're only a few years now from China mounting a military operation to recapture Taiwan. And if it tries, and we try to intervene, then we'll be reminded of the extent of our debt, and we will probably slink away. That's what I fear.
Well, I think that President Trump has tried to leverage whatever sovereign ability we have left after all these years of going into hock to China with the renegotiation of trade and trade imbalance and debt manipulation. And he did come up with this treaty. Now, although you're
a very good step in the right direction.
It is a good step, but your presentation here is brilliant in terms of the extent to which the communist Chinese have compromised most, if not all, of the nations of the world. And I think this is something that conservatives have been trying to blow the horn on for years, going back to with Clinton. I mean, he really should have been impeached for that scandal around China instead of getting distracted with this other thing, which is a whole different subject. But to go back to the China question, and by the way, just to finish up something earlier, I think that the best response to the charge of racism is to point out the real racist policies of the left and how what they've done to the Black community in the United States in particular, probably around the world, and talk about real racism rather than try to put everyone under a microscope and try to find if they said something insulting, 20 years ago, and then blow that up, which is what their main tool is. But getting back to China, you talk about, and I think quite brilliantly, of a conspiracy on the part of the communist Chinese, not only to cover up the pandemic, and then you had the World Health Organization, which, as you say, World Death Organization, as late as the late part of January, saying that this virus was not transmittable from person to person, which they knew was a lie.
Oh, yes. A major speech was made by Ghebreyesus on the 14th of January. By then, it was known perfectly well that it was transmissible from person to person, because we know that,
of course, everyone knew this.
Earlier in January had told the World Health Organization.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was obvious. And also, not to cast aspersions, and I know that this might be out of context, but I believe that Anthony Fauci also advised the Trump administration at that time that it was not a problem, and that there was criticism for President Trump putting in a ban of Chinese nationals coming into the United States in January from people like Fauci and like Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, who viciously attacked Trump for that.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, the trouble is,
the European Union, I mean, they didn't get around to putting in their own border ban until there were already thousands of deaths in Italy. So,
well, I mean, that was the Italian government, particularly in Lombardy, was very slow. Long after it was clear that China was the source of this infection, they allowed planes from China to come in because the World Health Organization had told them that's what they must do, that there was no need to shut down travel. And this is why I say it's a conspiracy, because at that time the World Health Organization can be proven to have been told with evidence by Taiwan that this virus transmitted from human to human. And it deliberately, information, gave precisely the wrong advice. And there's no point in having a supposed health organization that gives advice that was directly and materially responsible for the deaths, in particular in countries like Italy and Spain, where travel bans were not brought in as they were in America. And even in America, because so many of your senior officials were, of course, educated at universities now wholly controlled by Marxists.
Yes, exactly.
They themselves
and they were screaming about racism against, they were like Chinese men and women
being effective by encouraging people. There's actually some evidence that they actually encouraged people who wanted to come from China.
Oh, they did.
To the United States to go instead via South Korea and other places, because there was no control on flights from South Korea. So you flew from China to South Korea and then to the United States. And did anyone in the United States ask you, had you been in China in the past 3 or 4 weeks? No, they didn't, because the bureaucrats were determined to thwart Trump's efforts at controlling this infection. So
that's right. And let me just interject. I mean, we had in this country people like Nancy Pelosi and AOC and all these other leftists walking through their Chinatowns and saying, come on down and have dinner and have, go to the Chinese New Year. And that to oppose this was racist. You had something against Chinese people, which was ridiculous. But I want to get a little bit more specifically into the conspiracy here by the Communist Chinese, because I think you accurately identified this as such. It is a conspiracy. If they knew that it was passable by humans, but they got the WTO, their puppet, to lie about that. That is a political, criminal, international conspiracy. But the question is, I want to talk a little bit about their motivation. Do you think that the Communist Chinese wanted to spread this virus around the world?
I'll tell you what happened. Tell you exactly what happened. I think I've pieced it together. Now, some of this is speculative, and where it's speculative, I will say so. Where it isn't, I will say so. Now, what is known is that if you go to the Huanan wet market, which is where the Chinese say it came from, because they say they contact traced the first people who got it and they found it all traced back to there. And the story has been put about that it was in a bat, which was kept at the market, and then it went to a pangolin and then to a human. In fact, no bats are sold at the market, never have been. Pangolins, yes, which are a protected species of mammal, which the Chinese eat. They're a very dirty race in some ways when it comes to what they are willing to eat, and particularly the way they run these markets, where you have lots of different live species of mammal in cages, bleeding and rubbing against each other, and you want to transmit an infection from species to species. Wet markets are a great place to do it. That, therefore, is the official story. That's where it originated. And it raises the question why the World Health Organization, knowing from previous epidemics that come from China that these wet markets are a no-no, had done absolutely nothing to have these wet markets reformed or shut down. But that's another question. However, if you go 800 yards to the north-northwest of the Huanan wet market, you will come upon, this is very interesting, bet you didn't know this, the largest virological laboratory, research laboratory.
Oh, yeah. In Wuhan, yeah. And by the way, let me interject. The United States was involved in financing and giving grants to that organization all the way back to the 2001. Exactly.
Because remember, a lot of your officials, a lot of your senior congressmen have been to university and have been effectively recruited to communism while at university. The universities are going to have to be cleaned up, and that's another subject we'll come on to. But for the moment, let me go into this laboratory and tell you what they were doing there, because this has been pieced together. And most of this is quite well known inside the intelligence community, not so much outside. And here's what happened. They have been for some time researching the bat coronaviridae, because that is what the original SARS virus, again from China, though this time from a bit further south and east, was. And these bat viruses are a problem because bats live, particularly in China, which is a very hot and humid country, in enormous caves. And you'll have colonies of bats which are in some places in China, which have populations much the same as the entire human population of the Earth. I mean, enormous colonies. And of course, these are ideal conditions, particularly because bats scratch each other and so forth, ideal conditions for spreading all kinds of infections. It is therefore a perfectly proper source of study for the Chinese to work out how can we get a handle on these coronaviridae. Now, one of the points of having a P4 laboratory is that it's supposed to have very, very high standards of control so that the workers there, and in particular the student doctors who are studying there, should not manage to get splashed with blood or urine by these creatures that they're studying. Unfortunately, a vial of blood and urine, which was being kept because it was full of virions of various coronaviridae, was breached. Blood was splashed onto the skin of a doctoral student there. And that is all I can tell you about that doctoral student, because she used to have a biography and a photograph as well as her name on the website of the laboratory. Her name is still there. The photograph has gone. The bio has gone. All questions that we have put to the Chinese about where she is or how she is are met with the story that she is fine. So we say, can we please talk to her? Can we please see her? And we are not allowed to know where she is. I suspect that she's dead. I suspect that she was patient 0. And that before she developed frank symptoms, she had perhaps even been to the wet market. It was only 800 yards away, half a mile away, and spread it there. And from there, of course, it would go into the animals and out again. It would go absolutely everywhere. So that, I think, is patient 0. And that is how we know that, or we strongly suspect, as I say, it's speculative, we don't know what's happened to her, so we can't check this. But I suspect that that is why they were so very anxious to cover it up at the early stage, because it had actually emerged from a laboratory that was studying how not to allow these things to come out. There was apparently, and I haven't yet confirmed this either, so again, we're slightly speculative here, there was a failure of what's called a nuclear trigger, which is supposed to vaporize any vial which breaches containment. There's an automatic system which wasn't properly maintained. It failed. And so some of this was spilled onto the skin of one of the researchers there. So that is one reasonably, it's coming to be quite a well-established possibility. There's a slightly nastier side to this. I've had a look at the genome of the this particular coronavirus. It is about 80% identical to that of bats. However, it is the previously known bat coronaviridae. However, it does have certain features in the S proteins. Now, the S protein is a spike protein. If you think of a Viscount coronet and you see the spike sticking out of the top, and then you put 5 of those in a circle, that's what a coronavirus looks like. It has all these spikes coming out of it. Now, these spikes are what bind to the tissue of human cells so that they can tear open the cell wall and get inside the cell and then replicate. They do this not so much in the bloodstream as in the cell. They are intracellular organisms, these coronaviridae, and that's what the spikes are for. Now, there is some evidence from within China in Chinese, and I have not yet had it separately translated, so I cannot yet be sure that I'm right about this, which appears to suggest that in the S protein coding, there are 4 splicings which don't belong in any of the other bat coronaviruses, which are, however, identical with the same proteins on the outer lipid membrane of the HIV virus. It may be that somebody in that laboratory was, as we say in Yorkshire, playing silly boogers, playing around to see if they could put bits of the HIV virus into the coronavirus. Now, I don't think this was being done for weaponization. I think the Chinese realized that if they did anything like that and got caught, they would be international pariahs. And increasingly, they have to bear in mind that because they are holding down a disaffected citizenry, that as it has become more prosperous also wants to be more free, they cannot tell when somebody who has been privy to one of these programs will break free and tell us everything. So there is a kind of restraint on their doing some of the worst things they might otherwise have got up to. So I don't think there's any evidence that would satisfy me of deliberate weaponization. That there was some monkeying around with this coronavirus, as I say, it's speculative, but there is some indication that in that S protein there may have been some tampering, probably for innocent purposes, but with catastrophic effect, because it makes these particular S proteins much more effective at penetrating human tissue than the normal coronavirus. It is therefore much more infectious, and we now know the mechanism of why it's more infectious than a typical coronavirus, and certainly a lot more infectious than your standard viral pneumonias that cause flu. That is why already in Europe, where we had this slightly before America got it badly, in half a dozen countries of Europe, the European Monitoring Agency has found that the excess deaths, for instance, the last week, which they looked at was week 14 of the year, which was last week, there are severe excess deaths reported in 6 major European countries, Britain being one of them, France, Spain, Italy, Switzerland, a couple of others. These are attributed by the monitoring agency to the coronavirus. So what you should not do is believe some of the stuff I've heard from the, what we might call the slightly unthinking extreme right, saying, oh, no, you don't have to worry about this. Let all the old and sick people die. We can get through this and let's all acquire herd immunity. No, a lot of people would have ended up dead if that had been tried. They had to control the rate at which this spreads so as to make sure the health services weren't swamped. But certainly there is clear evidence that China knew a very great deal about the mechanism of operation of viruses of this sort because of the research that was going on at that laboratory just 800 yards from the wet market. They knew exactly what the characteristics of this virus were. So if they were to try, I mean, one old China hand, to whom I wrote about this the other day, came back and said, well, of course, you must accept there'll be a certain degree of confusion in the earlier stages. No, there wasn't. They knew as far back as November last year, the first traces I can find of internal control messages being sent between bits of the Communist Party in Wuhan about this. They knew in November it could pass from human to human. And they sat on it. They sat on it right through December.
Did they want to infect the world?
No, I think the problem of this, they are terrified of their own people, as every communist country has always been terrified.
Right.
And they knew that if it got out that yet another virus had escaped from communist China and had gone around the world causing mayhem, then this might prove to be their Chernobyl moment. One of the things that
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask that, because the final straw for the Russian people was Chernobyl. And the fact that Russia so obviously was lying about that and causing deaths and horror. And, it was the final lie after tens of thousands of lies going all the way back to Lenin, of course. But it was the final straw that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you think the same dynamic can happen here in China?
I think that's what the Chinese are frightened of. How near it is to happening, we'll discuss a bit later on. But let me first of all say that I know that the Chinese Communist Party is absolutely terrified of its own people. One of the things that we do, and the CIA does this too, because I used to work with Herb Meyer, who was the very distinguished and very sensible and right-thinking Deputy Director of Intelligence for the CIA when I was at 10 Downing Street. And one of the things that we used to do, Russia was then the big problem, China not so much, was undisclosed deletion analysis. Where there was information in circulation, it suddenly gets deleted and no explanation of why. That's a very interesting thing, because the question is, why did they delete it? And so with the internet, with much more information being circulated, undisclosed deletion analysis has become an extremely powerful weapon in the intelligence community's armory. And in Britain, we have some of the world-leading computer technology which actually was first developed even before the Second World War to monitor. We were able, even at that time, to monitor every single telephone call in Britain.
Sure.
And we've been able to do that automatically ever since we still can. And now we can increasingly do this with communications over the internet. And so if in various areas of interest, material becomes available online and then disappears, and then there is no explanation of why it disappeared, that becomes a piece of information that is of interest to us. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that in relation to the present pandemic, so that you can see what the intelligence community looks at when it does this sort of analysis. One thing that happened was patient zero's details disappeared off the Wuhan P4 laboratories website. That set up an immediate red flag on both sides of the Atlantic. We knew about that within minutes of their doing it. And so that's being looked at very actively now. Likewise, when the deputy director, as was Aylward, another communist, of the World Health Organization, gave that interview to the Hong Kong journalist, in which he kept on avoiding questions about when Taiwan would be allowed to join the WHO, why they'd ignored the information from Taiwan about it spreading from person to person. Hadn't Taiwan done really well in controlling the pandemic? And he fluffed all these questions so badly that he made it too obvious that the WHO was covering up for China, so he had to go. And there was previously on the WHO's website, among the Director General and his deputies, there was his biography and his name and his face. But you will no longer find it in that section of the WHO's website. But there has been no announcement to the effect that another Deputy Director General has been appointed and he's gone on to do something else. And the fact that that information has disappeared from that section of the website, but hasn't been flagged up by the WHO, is an indication to us that this is something we should be watching. So that's a couple of unclassified illustrations of the way this analysis works. And of course, if you have, as we do have, very powerful machines on both sides of the Atlantic monitoring this traffic all the time, we can spot every time the Chinese do this. They know we're spotting it. And the fact that they still do it tells us how frightened they are of their own people, how frightened they are of leaving information anywhere on the web that points to the complicity of the Communist Party in yet again launching another pandemic on the world. And that, incidentally, is why they suddenly began about 3 or 4 weeks ago misreporting their case numbers and death numbers, as though the whole thing had completely gone away.
Oh, there's some horror stories coming out of that, with burning people alive and just unbelievable atrocity inside China.
You do have a lot of the China watchers, particularly in Taiwan, in some cases in Hong Kong, who have access to grind with good reason, usually. And they can sometimes, in putting forward the information forward, they can go a little bit too far. However, they are useful to us because they do watch like a hawk. A lot of them read Chinese, and there's not enough of us that do. And so they can, they can read Mandarin. It's the same script actually for Mandarin or Cantonese. So once you read, you can get all the written information. And they are therefore looking at some of this material. For instance, there have been some very excitable reports that on 2 successive days, a lorry arrived at one of the funeral homes in Wuhan in Hubei province, with 4,500 urns for funerals on each one. Now, given that you only have about 120 funerals a week in that particular funeral home, this seemed to be an unduly large quantity to order all at one time. And so that has been flagged up as a potential indication there are more deaths going on than we're being told. But of course, you see pictures of this. Have the pictures been composed? Have they been faked by people who want to do China down? That's the kind of thing we would put down as a pointer. We would follow it up, but we wouldn't yet put too much weight on it. And that's why I'm saying whenever something is speculative, I'll tell you so. And then likewise, there is a funeral director in Taiwan who received a phone call from China saying, please, could they supply 200,000 body bags. Now, if you've only had a total of 3,000 dead in the whole of China because of this, you wouldn't suddenly need 200,000 body bags, would you? But again, yet discovered to what extent this information has been independently verified, where the order came from. None of that's been revealed.
It's hard to know because as we know, it's a communist country. They control all means of communication.
But of course,
So,
when we place an order outside, it is possible then for us to go and interview the Taiwanese funeral director, ask to hear who it was that placed the order. We will then know from our own information roughly. I say we. I should not pretend that I am a member of the intelligence community. I have worked on its fringes when I was at Number 10, but no. But nevertheless, this is how we as an intelligence community would do these things.
Well, I'm glad that there are some people in your intelligence community that seem to be on the right side of this. And sounds to me like you're beginning to zero in on some of these facts. And I'm hoping that you're able to bring them to the light of the public. I mean, I hope to do my small part here. I hope you get other media as well. I'd like to help in any way I can. I'm very happy and proud to be hosting you today, Christopher.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. What I will do is I'm going to do some further work, from outside the system, as it were, looking into it to identify some of the pointers, and I'll mark them as, whether they're speculative, whether they've been confirmed, whether the documents that are being posted up online are real, etc., etc. And then I will do the sort of intelligence analysis what I used to do, saying, well, this is the information that's come. These are the bits we know we can put in the bank. These are the bits that seem to be pointers that need further following up. These are the things we'd like the field agents to get on with. And then to try to assess the degree to which the fact of the Chinese Communist Party being so frightened of its own people because it has suppressed them for so long is now a problem for the world, in that if there is another outbreak from China, again from these wretched bats which exist in such large quantities there, this might happen again. And we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's not just a matter of holding to account the present regime. Why do we want to hold people to account when they've got it this badly wrong? It's not retribution that's the main reason.
No, it's trying to get honest people in there so we can solve this problem.
Exactly. Well, it certainly isn't racism. What it is,
of course not,
to say that we do not want this happening again. And this comes back to your question about the Chernobyl moment, which I do think we need to spend a bit more time on. And
yes.
There is no doubt in our mind. I was in Number 10 when Chernobyl happened, and I remember hearing about it just before I was going away for the weekend and thinking, crikey, that's the end of our nuclear development program for civil nuclear power. And it was. I mean, for a generation, nothing could be done because everybody was terrified of nuclear power. Then along came Fukushima, and everybody was terrified of it again. Actually, you don't need to be terrified of it. It's a very small killer per megawatt hour generated, terawatt hour generated, but that's another story. But one thing we were immediately able to gauge from our own contacts inside the system was the electrifying effect that the attempted cover-up by Gorbachev and his crowd at that had on the Chinese people. Because the one advantage that communism has over the democracies is the one which is being trumpeted quite forcefully by the Li Jinping at the moment and his foreign secretary, that we, precisely because we have a system of government that's very firm, we can take charge and we can stop these things happening. But the trouble is that there is a danger in that, and the danger is that because they don't want to lose face, and this is not a Chinese racialist characteristic, this is a characteristic of every totalitarian regime.
Of course,
they
it's a
cannot
communist thing.
afford to be seen to have made a huge administrative mistake.
Well, that's how you hold on to total power.
By the consent of the people, and therefore they're much more frightened of admitting they were wrong. So the problem, therefore, is that when this outbreak happened, and it is about the fifth since the year 2000 that's come from China. I think only one came of the big pandemics that's happened since 2000 has come from outside China. They all come from inside China, and they all exhibit this same pattern of the Chinese not stopping them at the outset because they're terrified of admitting to their own people that this is happening. And this is now this attitude of terror at their own people on the part of the Chinese regime is now, as we can see with this pandemic, a security risk for the rest of the world. The continued survival in office of the Chinese Communist Party is not only a risk any longer just to the people inside China, it is now a real risk, and a life and death risk at that, to the rest of the world. So we have an interest in making sure that insofar as it's possible to us to help and encourage the Chinese people to find a way of replacing the Chinese Communist Party, which has long outlived whatever sell-by date it ever had, with a proper democratic and accountable system. That is now something that, if the world is to survive and not have yet another of these things happening in a few years' time, we have to make sure that there is, to use the old phrase, regime change in China. So the question is, what are pointers indicating whether or not China is beginning to move in the direction of regime change? And again, I can give you only pointers, because information on any dissent from the party line on how wonderfully the Chinese are handling this virus is being even more ruthlessly suppressed and disappeared from the internet than ever before. There's never been such a shutdown. That's why we know how worried the Chinese Communist Party is about its own internal reputation.
I hope so. And also, I want to just say that, and by the way, I'd like to do a series with you, and I would like to have you back regularly, especially as you're developing further your sources and your information. And this is a very, very important discussion, and you're bringing some things to light that really are not well known or not known at all. And that's a very important thing. I feel that I'm happy to contribute to that. I personally, and this is complete, speculation, and I don't even want to get into it, but I actually believe there's something even more sinister going on with Communist China and with their interactions with and interlocking relationships with various groups and organizations and nations around the world. But that's my speculation. I'm not going to go there.
It's not speculation. The Chinese Communist Party is now pursuing an extremely aggressive and very subtle foreign policy. Now happens right across the world.
I mean, I see population control here. I see a lot of stuff going on, and I see the reality of the ground, as they used to say, is that we are all living now in a condition of medical martial law. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't go outside either. I don't want to get this dread disease. A disease is a disease. However, it all seems a little too convenient for me in terms of what this is doing to the Western democracies, both not only just economically, but even spiritually and morally, and how we conduct our affairs. This is a dream of the left. We're all stuck inside. Our freedoms as a result.
Your concern is justified. Let's be quite clear. The left, the climate communists, for instance, are terribly excited because, look, we're emitting far less CO2 and the world is still turning, and so therefore we told you could do it and now it's been done. However, this is going to be the new global warming. That's going to backfire on them because, for a start, it's already not as clear as it should be that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is falling commensurately with the vast reduction in emissions caused by the fact that people are not driving around or running their factories. So that's thing number one. So it's beginning to look as though trying to target CO2 is completely pointless because it's not going to change the concentration in the atmosphere very much. And even if it did, it wouldn't have very much of an effect on temperature. So there are two separate tests we could apply there. But let's get back to the central point you raise here, which is that doesn't it make me feel uncomfortable that governments have done these lockdowns and we've accepted them so passively? Well, now, I'm in two minds about this because, first of all, I studied epidemiology when the first HIV thing came along and realized then that if it wasn't stopped by pretty determined control measures, which would involve isolating the known carriers and following up their contacts, much as South Korea has done with this one, then tens of millions would die. Tens of millions did die because people were unwilling to believe the horrifying numbers that my model was coming up. I wrote the first model ever in Britain to model how a retrovirus like HIV would spread. And my predictions were absolutely bang on. I was looking back on them the other day. I published them in a newspaper eventually, and they caused an outcry. And government ministers have been called onto the television saying, "One of your former people is saying this. What do you say to this?" The poor health minister floundering around, saying it wasn't as bad as that, when I had actually got the internal report from his own communicable diseases surveillance center saying this is going to kill tens of millions. They'd come to the same conclusion as me. So I know a bit about this. And so when this virus came on, I didn't write a full-blown model because everybody else was already doing that, and there's no point in adding another model to the mix. What I did do was to rely on one very useful piece of information that one needs to know in the early stages of any pandemic. The spread is exponential. It's a compound rate of spread. So it was increasing in the 3 weeks up until when Trump declared a state of emergency worldwide at a rate of 20% per day. Now, if that had been allowed to continue, and there was no reason at that stage to suppose that it wouldn't, then a lot of people would have ended up dead very quickly. Health services around the world would have been overwhelmed. It had to be stopped. Now, in those countries that had low population densities, like Sweden, they could afford to take the risk of not doing these lockdowns. We, unfortunately, couldn't. You take New York, one of the highest population densities in the world, central London likewise, the whole of Bangladesh likewise, but the southeast of England, even if you include the countryside, has a population density second only to that of Bangladesh. So in those countries where you have a lot of people crowded together, this crucial person-to-person mean daily contact rate, which is much higher in high population densities than it is, for obvious reasons, in low population densities. That's where, once you have let it get out of control by not doing what South Korea did right from the start, and testing and isolating, then you have to have lockdowns, or a lot of people end up dead.
Oh, no question, and I'm not questioning.
So here is what we have to do to get out of it, because this is you can tell whether anyone inside the governmental system is trying to keep the lockdown in place too long, because on the whole they'd rather like to have this kind of fingertip control over people. And of course the Democrats very much, they would love to control people in this way.
Of course.
But on the centre right, we don't like that. We don't like, ideologically speaking, the very idea of a lockdown. That is why Boris Johnson dithered for so long, listening to the experts at Oxford University on the one hand, who were saying, let the old and the sick die. This is a very typical Oxford attitude. Yeah. Let the old and the sick die. They are a drag on the economy, and we don't care about them. Let them go. Keep the economy going. Let everybody acquire what was very tellingly described by our Chief Medical Officer of Health, who has not been allowed to do a press conference since, as herd immunity. Can you imagine talking to the British people about their herd immunity? It is a term of art, admittedly, in virology, but nevertheless, you should never use that to the public. But he said, we want to let everybody get it. Never mind how many people die, because otherwise we have to close down the economy, and that would be terrible, etc., etc. Whereas at Imperial College London, where they're slightly more hard-headed and less sort of ethereal and out of touch than Oxford is, they were saying, look, if you let this spread within days, not even weeks, within days, the National Health Service will be overwhelmed. And once that happens, the British people will no longer sit docilely by. They'll all go ape, and they'll start setting up vigilante groups to stop people coming in from outside, and you'll have a complete breakdown of social order. And that indeed could have, we really were very close to that. So it was necessary, and Boris, had to be dragged kicking and screaming, but in the end he had to take a command decision between the Oxford people, kill the old people, kill the sick people, they don't matter, let the rest of us get on with our lives, on the one hand, which would have led, I think, to societal breakdown. And on the other, the Imperial College people say, no, we want to do this in an orderly way. That means you're going to have quite a strict lockdown, but not for all that long. If the lockdown works, we'll know from there are various ways, the public transport figures down by 85 to 95%, the traffic on the roads, ditto, the contacts between people as measured by the anonymized telephone companies' data with the mobile phones, down by 85, 95%. That, of course, interferes with that person-to-person contact, brings down the rate of infection, so that in Italy and in Spain, already today, they've announced that they're going to begin a progressive, I should say, unlocking of the lockdown to allow certain businesses with a slightly lower risk than others to start going back to work, to start using public transport again. They're going to need to protect their public transport workers. They are just as much frontline as health service workers, less sexy maybe, but just as much frontline. even more at risk in some ways than health workers. They need protective gear. So we have to get that right. And our government is very well behind the curve on this, because where were we buying all our protective gear from? Where did the NHS place a large order when they suddenly knew this was coming? China, which then supplied a fantastic quantity of substandard stuff that couldn't be used. And Boris is going to have to get into an argument with China about getting
anyway. Christopher, I'm going to have to leave it there, because if I do longer, the whole show might be too big to download. So what I'm going to do is I'd like to have you back in a week or two, maybe a week and a half, and we can continue, because I can see that you're starting to develop some very important things. And all right, so Lord Christopher Monckton, Viscount of Brenchley, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. Let my viewers and listeners know where they can reach you if you want to, or websites that you'd like to let them know about.
Well, the best place to go is whatsupwiththat.com, which is the biggest climate website in the world. It's a skeptical website, WATTS, upwiththat, all one word, .com, run by a distinguished meteorologist called Anthony Watts, who has it beautifully moderated. His chief moderator is a wonderful guy called Charles Rotter. And they run this absolutely first-class website where both sides of the should we or shouldn't we lock down, when should we let off the lockdowns, are being argued. And I have a daily piece there saying, yes, lockdowns were necessary, but now on the figures, it's beginning to look as though we can start relaxing them. And we must, this is the point I want to end on, we must not leave these lockdowns in place for a single moment longer than necessary. We have to make it clear to the bureaucratic class that this kind of interference with our liberties is something that we do not tolerate lightly. We have very largely tolerated and respected it, and for good reasons until now, but it mustn't be left in place one moment longer than it needs to be. And we haven't got time now to go into the preconditions for lifting lockdowns. We'll have to do that on another occasion, but I've done a certain amount of work on that too.
By all means. All right, Christopher, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
A great pleasure. God bless you. And as always, God bless America. God bless Canada. God bless all of Her Majesty's dominions.
Thank you, sir. And I will talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
All the best.